now we can see a new world coming into view. A world in which there is a very real prospect of a new world order. The new world order does not mean surrendering our national sovereignty or forfeiting our interests. He took an oath to defend the Constitution of the United States of America. By some, he's been called controversial. How can I convince you when your ears begin to hear? You turn your heart away from me each time when I draw near. Your eyes begin to meet with mine, they glance away in fear. Now, keep in mind that some of my guests have been approached by Homeland Security or FBI saying, why are you going on the Clay Douglas show? My message to those guys, if they're listening this morning, is go get a cup of coffee, maybe a white one. We both took the same vote. To defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I don't recall there being an expiration date on that. Well, it's just a show. How can I sing the language and the state? Knowing that your rights blinded by the lies. He is the free American, Clay Douglas. Blinded by the lies. Catch the Free American weekdays at 7 a.m. Pacific, 10 a.m. Eastern. Every time I think about the damage that's been done, the anger was inside me till I'm almost overcome. I want to tear the moon down, the sky and from the sun. For the podcast and more details, visit www.freeamerican.com or catch the podcast by phone by calling 832-999-8621.
All right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another edition of the Free American Hour. And I may have played the wrong introduction here for my show today. My guest today is Charles Lincoln the Third, and I did have another thing here by old friend Carl Klang. Let me just do a segment of that.
Today, we're all going to learn a new term. It's only 2 words. Now listen closely. Can all of you say constructive fraud? Constructive fraud!
Did you ever get the feeling? You're staring at the ceiling. He took an oath to defend the Constitution.
Yeah, that was Carl Klang. Why the banksters keep us dumb. Charles, welcome to the show, Charles.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I ran across some statistics I was kind of surprised at the other day. There is not today in the United States a single AAA rated bank and I guess, I don't know why that surprised me a little bit, but I guess I thought that there might be some private banks or something that had maintained that rating. But worldwide, in the top 50 banks, the very first bank that is based in the United States is rated number 29, and the only one of there are only 5 banks on the top 50 list based in the United States, and the only one of those that is a big 5 consumer lender is Wells Fargo, and that's like number 49. it's kind of fascinating that the American banking system has fallen even by world standards, which we kind of set. We kind of set up the world standards for banking. We and the Queen did, but it's amazing to think that American banks we are outcompeted by about 10 banks based in Asia, which 100 years ago was not part of the banking system at all. Actually, 60 years ago, even when Nixon and Kissinger first went over there was no such thing as a mainland China bank that was in competition with the rest of the world. And just since 1974, in other words, we have just like imploded. And up to a point, I mean, I guess I'm kind of happy about that, because I think that credit banking is basically a bad thing. And I think last time we were together, you quoted the famous line of Thomas Jefferson about what will happen if Americans allow bankers to define their money. Well, the people who are now defining the money of the world are based in China and Singapore. And that's kind of a topsy-turvy world.
I've been hearing a lot that goes across the internet, not a lot of detail in our mainstream news, about BRIC, B-R-I-C, that's Brazil, Russia, India, and China becoming the force behind the world banking systems. And in Europe, we've got the Libor scandal, and there's certainly, I think people are actually going to jail on that. In Iceland, they kicked the bankers out and bailed out the people. Makes them pretty unique. Hungary may be the same thing. And I've got questions about this whole Chinese system. I've told people that this whole Cold War that we went through for over 50 years was a scam. The Russian people were never our enemy. That was only Hollywood. The Russians are coming. The Russians are coming. Be afraid. Be afraid. The Russians are coming. The Russians suffered the loss of 60 million people murdered under communism. China suffered maybe 100 million people murdered under communism. And maybe the Russians kind of got tired of it. The Chinese may have got tired of it, and it looks like the Chinese are building their country the way Americans built ours back in the old days before the banks. What's going on now? Let me also let people know that you are an attorney, or were an attorney. You may have you can clarify that if you want. And you work for some of the banking systems. And in this last issue, the first issue of the Free American, out in 2014, I have on page 36, who is Charles Lincoln III. You began work as an associate of Cadwalder, Wickersham, and Taft. You finished a judicial clerkship. You worked as an archaeologist, and that maybe in maybe the second hour, I'd certainly like to talk to you about that, because we've got cities that have been discovered in Africa that are 150,000 years old that we can't build today. That means there was sometime in the distant past, there was a worldwide civilization here that may have had flying machines able to cross oceans, and certainly we can't build a pyramid today, so that may be a topic for a different discussion. But what about this banking system? What about the BRIC? What about the Libor scandal? Are the banks losing their hold? Is 2014 the end of the world, end of the line for the banksters? What's going on?
I wish it were, but I think they're still pretty much in charge, especially in Europe. Every time you hear about a scandal, and every time you hear about being prosecuted, bankers being prosecuted, what it really comes down to, I'm afraid, is they're covering up. I've seen this over and over again in the United States, in more than anywhere. I follow it more closely here than in the U.S. All these government prosecutions, they're just window dressing. They're just totally window dressing. Like they announce a settlement, big headline news: Bank of America pays $25 million in California to Kamala Harris, Attorney General out here. And I hate to tell you, $25 million to the Bank of America is less than that bucket change. All of these prosecutions and settlements, I mean, even if they're a couple of $100 million, they are literally a handful of, if anyone gets meaningful relief out of them, I haven't met them, and basically even a $250 million settlement in California might relate to, 250 houses, and there are that many houses being foreclosed every day in every court in every county in the state of California, and pretty much all over the country too. So these settlements and these prosecutions you hear about are just cover. I mean, they're just a distraction that people say, oh, they solved the robo signing problem. They're prosecuting LIBOR. Wow, big settlement. The Bank of America paid, even if the Bank of America had paid $500 million, it's still nothing compared to what they've made off of these frauds. LIBOR is a particularly fascinating phenomenon because it's so obviously crooked. It's hard to believe it ever existed anywhere. The LIBOR is the London Interbank Offered Rate, and I know you know the phrase the fox watching the chicken coop.
Yeah.
But this is really the fox. LIBOR is pretty much the foxes breeding chickens. It's a fascinating thing because LIBOR is where the top banks set their own interest rate, and they can change it from minute to minute. And in fact, they do. And one interesting consequence of that is that in the United States, at least, that renders almost all consumer protection laws useless, because one of the things that they have to, that a credit extender has to guarantee under, for example, the Truth in Lending Act, is it has to give you what's called the good faith estimate of what your loan is going to cost, assuming regular payments, no serious delinquencies, things like that. And when you've got a LIBOR loan, there's no way of telling what the interest rate is going to be because you have no control over your own contract. You could start out at a 0.5% interest rate and literally be at 20% tomorrow if the banks decided it. This is the most unstable, crooked way of operating a marketplace in the world. It's not the buyers, it's not the consumers of the good who have complete control over the prices by supply and demand. That's what one expects. It's not the government that would be supposedly operating on behalf of the people. It is the people who stand to make the money, who basically just get to decide from minute to minute how much money they want to make. I'm sure everybody would like to have a business like that. We'd all love to be able to decide how much money we need today. Okay, I need to be earning 20% today. Oh, I earned 20% yesterday. I can earn half a percent today. The fluctuations weren't quite that radical, but they oftentimes got close. And the point is, over the life of any loan, any 20 to 30 year mortgage, it was easily foreseeable that LIBOR would lead to next door neighbors with the same facial loan ending up with radically different history. And so, I mean, LIBOR is just one of the most bizarre things in the world. It violates every principle of antitrust, every principle of consumer protection, and yet, I think even in Europe, what's going to happen right now is they will administer a few wrist slaps, maybe not rap somebody on the knuckles. Maybe if they really have somebody they want to get rid of, they might put one or two people in jail, probably right next to Andreas Breivik, where he can, he's basically using his jail time to go to a university and study political science, and may not be a bad thing, but it's really not. It doesn't exactly qualify as hard time, this is just a bizarre world we live in, and LIBOR, I think, is just symptomatic of how much power we actually gave to the banks, how much incredible control over our existence we surrendered when no one consciously did this. I mean, nobody ever got up, except maybe Alexander Hamilton, and said, we want a world run by banks.
That's why we had men like Aaron Burr stand up and shoot the son of a bitch. Right?
Well, here's one of the problems with standing up and shooting people. When you stand up and shoot people, you tend to make them martyrs, and I'm afraid that was the long-term result of Aaron Burr shooting him. Everybody thinks Aaron Burr is a crook and a bad guy, even though he was Thomas Jefferson's handpicked vice president. And everybody thinks that Hamilton was great. I've got a book right by the computer this morning. I don't know if you've seen it or not. Hamilton's Curse by Thomas J. DiLorenzo.
No, I haven't seen that. But you're welcome to tell me about it.
Thomas J. DiLorenzo, he's an author of some really amazing. I met him through the 10th Amendment Society, 10th Amendment Foundation here in Los Angeles. If anybody has not heard of the 10th Amendment Foundation, look it up. Michael Bolden is the director, and the 10th Amendment group. You wouldn't expect Los Angeles to be a hotbed of really amazing pro-constitutional scholarship and activism, but by and through Mike Bolden's 10th Amendment Foundation, it absolutely is. And anyhow, Thomas, the first time I attended a meeting of the 10th Amendment group, it was in Atlanta, Georgia. They were having a special election seminar. Oh golly, this is back in 2009, 2010, I think. It was in Atlanta, Georgia, and it was their first national meeting, and Thomas DiLorenzo was there. He was there again in Los Angeles in 2012, and basically he's written books called The Real Lincoln, How Capitalism Saved America, and Lincoln Unmasked. That's Abraham Lincoln, not me.
No relation, right? No relation.
Oh, we are. It's back through some ancestors in Taunton, Massachusetts.
All right. I tell people, man, I really don't care who your grandmother slept with. Okay, I mean, to me, we judge by your actions. We judge by what you do today. We judge you by your words. We don't judge you by who your grandmother slept with, and our Constitution pretty well takes care of, the freedom of religion. So if you want to bang your head against that Wailing Wall, knock yourself out. Just I'll watch.
Anyhow, my grandmother raised me, and I'm pretty sure she slept with exactly one guy in her life, and that would have been my grandfather. So not worried too much about her. But anyhow, Hamilton's Curse is a wonderful book, and how Jefferson's arch enemy betrayed the American Revolution and what it means for Americans today. And it's just an amazing book that relates Alexander Hamilton's 20 years, basically, from 1784, when he founded the Bank of New York, which ultimately became my law firm's, Cadwallader's, very first client, to 1805, when he was killed in a duel. Those 20 years, he totally shaped the trends that ultimately dominated America. I mean, I think it'd be fair to say that Hamilton did not finally win until the establishment of the Federal Reserve in 1913, so he never actually lived to see the ultimate fruit of what he was doing. But his people just don't realize that Hamilton was a monarch. He was in no sense in favor of a democratic.
Oops, what's that?
I don't know, it's not me, I'm here.
No. I don't know, not me either, so.
Just connecting far.
Okay. No, technicality here. Go ahead. Let me stop you for just a second here. Now, you mentioned the LIBOR. We're talking about the banks here. After the Federal Reserve was established, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, probably not his real name, forced the Americans to give up their gold. They had to turn it into the banks, and they were paid $16 an ounce for it. And shortly after the banks got all the gold, they doubled the price to $32, where it may still stand today. Yet if you want to go out and buy gold, you got to pay $1,500 or so now. And I understand that in the city of London, the Rothschild Central Bank there, they have their little meeting in the city of London where the Queen has to ask permission to enter, and they sit down at a desk and they raise the flag, a little flag on their desk, to decide the price of gold. I don't know if that's true or not, but it brings the question up, who sets the price on gold? What's the deal on that?
Well, I don't actually know about the meeting you're talking about, but there's certainly a lot of strange rumors. There are basically two prices of gold, and I think you're absolutely right about that. There's the commodity price, which is the 1,500 you're talking about, and of course that's just set by whatever commodity speculators can push it up or down on any given day. Got a pretty good idea how that works. There's a new movie out called Wall Street, The Wolf of Wall Street. I have to recommend that fairly highly for anybody who wants just a refresher on just how crooked and meaningless the whole stock market business is, and what it means to say that we're a casino society that just bets on meaningless fluctuations in prices. That's what the $1,500 in gold is. But one assumes, now I say one can only assume, that based on world banking traditions, there is actually a private rate for gold at which all currencies are compared. Now, that is kind of speculative, and I bet a lot of professional economists and bankers would deny that if you ask them outright if there's a private, if there's still a fixed gold to currency exchange rate. But it seems that there almost has to be, because the relationship between the currencies of the world is so stable, so controlled. They must have some kind of fixed standard at which they're rating currencies. And the only one that's ever worked in history was gold. Now, if they've got something else based on some extremely complicated formula, such as they might have, it's just not been publicly disclosed. But my guess is that, in fact, there are private deposits of gold, privately controlled deposits of gold, which are being used by consortiums like Rothschild, Lazar, whatever, Lazar Frere. We don't know exactly who is doing it, but it seems likely that there is an objective way in which the relationship between the Chinese yuan, the euro, and the dollar and the yen are all maintained. It seems very likely that there is such a thing, but it's kind of speculative. All we know is that the private individual has no role in that at all, and that's, of course, what Roosevelt did. He took away the power of the people to be involved in the monetary system, which, if you think about it, is possibly one of the most oppressive acts ever committed. He took the power. I mean, whether there was democracy or Roman Empire, Roman Republic, the despotic empires of the ancient world, people were always able to control some aspect of their economy by owning things, owning gold, owning wheat, owning, what Marxists call the means of production. And basically, when you take the ability to actually control the value of your products away from the people, you've obliterated them as having any kind of freedom. They are totally dependent, much like LIBOR. I mean, LIBOR is just an example of this, right? How the people have no power over their own day-to-day well-being and destiny, because we've allowed banks to set interest rates any way they want. We've allowed the government to establish monopolies. You mentioned the law license. The law license is just, again, one of the truly tragic examples of the abuse of the mercantile power of the government. And by mercantile power, I mean the power to define market prices, and the ability of the government to license the practice of law, which, if you think about it, is nothing more than talking about law. That is really what the practice of law is. There have always been people who specialize in this, that, and the other thing, but the practice of law simply cannot be defined in any way that really would permit any kind of government regulation, especially in light of that famous thing called the First Amendment. And the power of the government to define marketplaces and regulate marketplaces is just gargantuan, and I think people are beginning to realize just how destructive it is. And maybe if anything good comes out of LIBOR, it'll be that LIBOR is such an extreme example of it, that we will see a reaction and maybe a tendency to deregulate the basic function of the economy, which is negotiation of value and price.
Now, in that same time period of the 30s, we had the engineer depression. We had people put out of work. But there was something else. We had gold stolen from the American people, and we still don't know to this day if we've got any gold left in Fort Knox or not, or if they just replaced it all with cocaine or heroin. We don't know. But something else happened. On the back of a 1914 $10 bill, they had two illustrations on the back of that $10 bill. One was of factories on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side, they had a hemp field. Now, I've tried to tell people that in the 30s there, you know, the way William Randolph Hearst got that castle up on top of that mountain there on the coast of California was for helping them steal our #1 cash crop, billion-dollar crop. And I'm not talking about marijuana here, guys. I'm talking about hemp. The most useful plant in the world, the healthiest plant in the world, food, shelter, fuel, everything right there. And that got eliminated. They didn't want Americans to be productive. For 100 years in this country, the Encyclopedia Britannica was printed on hemp paper. Our Constitution was printed on hemp paper. The sails of our ships were made out of hemp. The ropes tied those ships up, hemp ropes tied those ships up to the docks. They took our #1 cash crop and transferred it to Russia, China, Philippines, Mexico, Canada, anywhere but America here. And you used to be able to pay your taxes with hemp.
I never heard that. Where would you have been able to do that? That's interesting.
In World War II, you can go to my website and read Jack Hara, my friend Jack Hara. I financed Jack Hara while he was doing the research on that. He did a book called Emperor Wears No Clothes.
Okay.
And after World War II, the government told the farmers to start growing hemp again. We needed more hemp because we were at war in the Philippines. We were at war in the Pacific. So you know, Hemp for Victory was a film that they made in that same time period around World War II.
I've definitely seen that. I just never heard of paying your taxes in hemp. That's interesting. It's believable because they needed it for the rope for the Navy in particular.
It was a commodity just like corn. I mean, except a little bit better for you than corn. I've got a film up on my Facebook site, Free American 69, about a couple of guys that bought an acre of land to grow corn to follow the corn crop, and you know, they're basically genetically modified corn. Rats won't eat it, but they want to feed it to your children. And if we were growing hemp here, it was a commodity. We could base our money on that commodity, which I've heard, and you might be able to clear this up for me. I don't really know that much about it. That Bitcoin, they're saying that the whole Bitcoin phenomena is basically derived from Thomas Edison proposing a currency based on commodities, what you could grow in your backyard. And I tell people, you know, if you can grow food, not grass. Why would you grow grass in your backyard? You can grow food in your backyard. You can put a solar unit on your roof and make your house, let your house pay for itself and provide you with electricity. But we don't quite, that doesn't quite happen now, does that? They don't want you to be self-sufficient.
I totally believe in a currency based on commodities. I mean, that is what currency originally was. It was an exchange of commodities. I don't know if we talked about this last time or not, but the ancient Romans the ancient Roman currency, we think of them using coins, and obviously they did produce a great many of gold and silver coins, but in addition, they had the basic medium of exchange was cattle. Head of cattle were the key media of exchange, estimate of everyone's wealth and value in ancient Rome. The word, anybody who knows any Spanish might recognize the word agropecuaria. We have a related word in English, pecuniary, and pecus was the Latin word for cattle. And absolutely, wheat, hemp, any crop that's useful, any livestock could and should be used as a basis for currency. And certainly Bitcoin is based on this general idea that people can monetize their own material wealth. I don't think it will survive as long as the income tax survives, because the simple truth is they don't want any system of currency that competes with the Federal Reserve note, because the Federal Reserve note is tied in with the income tax, and every attempt to get away from taxable notes is opposed by Congress and the courts. They will prosecute anyone they can for what they call a system of barter, which basically means anything where your exchange or transactions are not measurable and in fact measured in very precise exchanges of quote-unquote value rated in valueless Federal Reserve notes.
But people are still doing this. I mean, it's still happening. I mean, for 20 years now, since I've been publishing the Free American, I've been reporting on something called Ithaca Hours. And recently, a few months ago, I talked about mountain money, or high country hours that they're doing in Colorado. That you work for an hour, it's worth $10. And Ithaca Hours has been going for 20 years. They use that as a medium of exchange in that particular county, and we could actually do that in county to county and trade your time and your labor and your products for this type of barter. And it really is just barter. And they don't like barter. They've been trying to stop that forever. So you're right about that too.
They want to control every second. They want to be able to tax every second, everything you do. I mean, they're constantly trying to think that, by they I mean the federal government. It's taxation. One famous Hamiltonian who said a lot of good and non-Hamiltonian things was Chief Justice John Marshall, longest-serving Chief Justice of the U.S. in 1800 to 1835. But one of the most amazing things he ever said was, the power to tax is the power to destroy. And it is absolutely, positively true. And if they can't tax you, they're worried they can't get rid of you, they can't destroy you. And there's nothing. The only thing that the U.S. government wants to be non-destructible is the U.S. government. Everything else needs to be subject to being eliminated. You, me, everything we do. Those private matters that we consider important, such as our own lives, our own families, the government wants complete control. The government wants complete and absolute power to destroy us and everything we do.
That's what I tell people. They have refined the art of slavery to the point that the slave don't know they're slave. I'm not a slave. I can go get my pickup, go get a beer, watch. And Ayn Rand had it ran too. That's another one of my favorite quotes. I were up there with Thomas Jefferson. The government has no control over honest citizens, so they have to make criminals out of us. When you make the most productive plant in the world illegal, you start putting people in jail for possession of marijuana. You know, if a man with a badge can come up to you and say, "What's that in your pocket? Is that marijuana? Is that cocaine? What is that powder? What is it?" Whoa! You're gonna go to jail. You're gonna go work for IBM for 25 cents an hour. You know, that's that's exactly what it is. I mean, if you want real freedom, you know, abolish all the laws against victimless crimes, tear down that wall, Mr. Obama, and put up tables, and let the Colombians and the Mexicans and the Peruvians bring all their products up, lay it on the table, pay a duty on it, which is the government's only honest form of income. Let it lay on the table. Let Americans come over and pick it up. If you want to buy enough heroin to kill yourself with, you know, go stand in that corner over there, and so we can just roll your body over into that pit.
Well, in this book, Hamilton's Curse, he warns about the abuses of tariffs and duties. But so there's a problem with every kind of government taxation. But you know, I've been saying for a long time, and this is related to another thing we've talked about, in terms of, you know, website we just got going, Southern Spirit Rising. You know, this question of hemp is so fascinating to me because it raises the issue of government control again over the basic means of production, basic agricultural productivity of the world. And isn't it interesting how that was the issue in 1860? People talked about it as being an issue of slavery or even states' rights. Neither one of those quite got to the heart of the matter, which was that there were people who wanted the government to plan everything. There were people who simply wanted to hand over private decision-making, private freedom to think and evaluate what's good for you, what's good for me, what's good for your neighbor. You know, in the original America, everybody made those decisions. You know, you use the dramatic example of if you want enough cocaine to blow your brains out, literally. And that's, of course, an extreme example, but in the same way that the power to tax is the power to destroy, if you don't have complete control over what you do with your life, life or death, you don't have complete control over your life. Period. It's a pretty simple concept here, but the hemp farmers and the people who want to grow hemp, the people who want an unregulated agricultural regime in the United States, are fighting exactly the same war against slavery, oddly enough, against universal slavery, as the Confederate States of America were fighting in 1860. And I think that people need that kind of depth of history to see the connection between individual choice, individual freedom, individual autonomy that has been the key feature of the dynamic of the political and social dynamic in the society for 250 years now, ever since the beginning. Do other people plan our lives, or do we plan our own lives? And the hemp farmers today, the people in California who are fighting for medical marijuana, which is basically, you know, just another example of Ayn Rand's maxim. You know, they decided they couldn't make it completely illegal to keep this popular product that made so many people feel better in California. So what did they do? They introduced a whole different level of regulation. So basically, what medical marijuana achieved is just a perfect example of why you don't want government planning your economy. Because in California now, you've got two ways of violating marijuana laws, the hemp laws. You can either be an ordinary criminal, circulating marijuana for profit, anyone who buys it, or you can bend over backwards to try to comply with the medical marijuana laws in California. And basically, those are so complicated, those are so difficult, those are so Byzantine in their complexity that people are now going to jail on totally separate charges that didn't exist before for the violation of medical marijuana laws.
Now, I just wrote here, just before we launched on this subject, in my chat room here, I said, why should I bribe a doctor to get a piece of paper to allow me to smoke a plant I can grow in my backyard?
That's a very good question. I mean, that's fascinating. That's absolutely, positively fascinating.
You know, I was kind of excited, Charles, when we passed the medical marijuana law in Arizona. I said on the radio, wow, this is really great, man. For the first time in 45 years, I may not be a criminal anymore. Except I couldn't get medical marijuana because I didn't go to a doctor. I didn't have anything wrong with me. And I said, the reason I don't have anything wrong with me is I've been smoking this for 45 years. I don't have cancer. I still got my appendix. I still got my tonsils. Not a damn thing wrong with me. Why would I go to a doctor and beg him to write me a prescription, pay him $100 to write me a prescription for something that'll grow in my backyard?
Well, if you think about it, all natural substances, you've got that question to deal with. Why should gold be regulated when if you own a gold mine, you can produce your own?
Right.
Why should tobacco or chocolate? I mean, do you realize how many regulations there are relating to chocolate milk, chocolate candy bars in the United States? I mean, just to get a glass of milk in the United States is hard enough. To get a glass of chocolate milk is doubly difficult. Everything is regulated, and it doesn't matter how easy it is to produce on your own. I mean, milking a cow requires a certain amount of physical strength. I've tried it, and it's not easy. But it is not rocket science. It is totally not rocket science. And anyone can do it, but the federal government has mountains of paper regulating who can produce how much in the way of milk. And if you think about it, that's as close to a surreal, insane thing as anything can be, and yet, precisely because it's so common, it was the very first substance that the FDA and its antecedents started to regulate. Because what you want is to be, again, if you want government to be able to regulate every minute of your life, you want government to be able to regulate that which you do every single day. And that's interesting. It's an interesting proposition that you are basically forced to accept the government's dictates about how you milk your cow and what you do with the milk afterwards.
Now listen, let me just add a comment here that there was a guy in next to New York, state next to New York, that had his farm raided, had his cattle confiscated because he was taking whole milk to New York.
I mean, there's a lot going on. There's a lot going on. I don't know the particular case you're talking about, but yes, whole milk is somehow a great threat to uh, great threat to people living happy lives, right?
Yep.
I don't.
It might be healthy. I mean, they hadn't had a chance to poison that yet.
Yeah, I mean, the things that are pure are not government regulated. Yeah, but I think it is a psychologically interesting thing just about the origin of law in general. When you're coming up with legal systems, you're coming up with things you want to regulate. You want to regulate above all the things that are most, you know, if you think about the difference between the the text of the Code of Federal Regulations. One interesting thing about the Ten Commandments is it's really not that difficult to abide by the Ten Commandments. These are very simple laws that you can pretty much lead your life and not have to worry too much about your ability to comply with the Ten Commandments. I mean, okay, we're all subject to envy. I guess that's the most difficult thing of all, is we all tend to covet that which is our neighbor's. That may be the most difficult, but still, you can work on that, and even if you covet it, you just don't have to let on that you're coveting it. So, it doesn't hurt your neighbor or it doesn't injure your neighbor in any way. You can control your covetousness for, especially your neighbor's wife and things like that. But the federal regulations are so much more like Deuteronomy and Leviticus that try to regulate every single aspect of life. In particular, the only thing in the Ten Commandments really about sex is no adultery and do not covet your neighbor's wife.
Well, even
And
that.
again,
Let me just correct you. The term adultery does not necessarily mean putting a make on your neighbor's wife. It means your blood. The Bible told us, to keep our bloodlines pure.
Oh,
Don't.
I mean, I'm very familiar with that. I'm familiar with that interpretation. My point really, and if you construe it that way, it's even easier to comply with. My point was that if you get into Deuteronomy and you get into something much more like the Code of Federal Regulations and here. Okay, went away. And Ayn Rand's dictum about how you need to make everything a crime. Milk is a perfect example.
Okay, hang on, you just broke up on me here. Let me see what.
Yeah, we're getting some bad static for some reason.
Yeah, it's this is Fusion Centers stepping in. We're making too much sense. We're tired. They when they tried to demonize the militia, they brought some militia guys on NBC, and they were the ones that were screaming, "You can have my gun, but you can take it from my cold dead fingers." I said, I'm accused of starting the militia by the ADL, but nobody ever interviewed me because this is the way I talk, this is the way I think, and everything that you're saying, everything that we've talked about here makes perfect sense, common sense. We're not trying to tell anybody to go out and kill anybody. We're trying to tell you that, it's never been easy to be free, ever, throughout history. And that's really what the Bible is about. It's a story about how individuals were standing up against tyranny. And I've said the money changers that Jesus ran out of the temple, they're still with us. They just changed the name of the temple. They call it the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England and the you know World Bank now.
Well, for a long time, banks were designed to look exactly like temples. As a matter of fact, the neoclassical design, they were consciously trying to make them look like temples. But anyhow, my only point really was that, if you look at the most ancient laws of mankind, they're all about regulating sex, and they're all about regulating what you eat. And since almost everybody either has or would like to have sex, and everybody who's alive has to eat something, those are the ways of controlling people. Those are the ways of getting at people's, that they can't get away. You have to regulate the basic necessities of life if you're going to control people. And I think that we just need to be so conscious of that in when we're fighting and when we're trying to define what is a good law and what's a bad law. One thing that's becoming increasingly obvious to me, for example, is that the so-called family domestic relations laws in the United States are totally designed to destroy people's consciousness of freedom and their autonomy in how they conduct their lives. And I think this is the most sinister thing that's going on in the United States or anywhere in the world today, is that the most productive individuals in society, the people you would really call the soundest members of society, are being systematically taken apart and destroyed in divorce court, in custody battles. The whole deal that went in 30 or 40 years ago about no-fault divorce has turned into the most outrageous fraud in the history of the world, except maybe for the banking system. One of the most outrageous frauds in the world, because no-fault divorce once you enter a divorce court, basically, if you got more than 2 dimes rubbed, you get out. If you've got kids and you end up in divorce court, you never get out. You are subject to the jurisdiction of these courts, messing with your lives at least until your kid turns 18, your youngest kid turns 18, and possibly significantly longer than that. And this is just analogous, really, to the business of regulating hemp, regulating milk. You regulate what people cannot do without. You regulate and control what is absolutely essential to society. And we have to figure out ways to get control of our agriculture, to get control of our family lives, to get control of how we raise our children again. And I think that one of the most basic ways to do this is people need to become educated and aware of history. I mean, the 1914 $10 bill is interesting, that you need to know so much more about people, how we got from the free society of Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson to, again, as Thomas DiLorenzo's book says, a government much more oppressive, much more controlling, especially since 1933, than even Andrew Hamilton ever dreamed of. Andrew Hamilton never envisioned milk regulation, and yet milk regulations are, in fact, what the FDA has used, especially since the 1930s, to control the economy. I mean, this is a trivia fact that is kind of like the only 5 U.S. banks in the top 50 banks worldwide. Do you realize that there have been more U.S. Supreme Court decisions about milk than any other substance.
Now,
Any substance in commerce.
we're approaching our second hour here, and I'd like to talk about some history.
All right.
You have now correct me if I'm wrong here. You have some history that you want to talk about. Let's talk about New Orleans. Let's talk about the Confederacy. Let's talk about what this wasn't a war over slavery, and it was blacks that sold their own people out. It was Jews that provided the ships to bring them over here. And I got a feeling that many of the slaves in America in the 1800s were a lot better off than they were in the jungles of Africa. But let's talk about the Confederacy. Let's talk about what's going on in New Orleans. Don't you have something planned for New Orleans? Don't you have something planned? I think I've been offered a role.
2 weeks tomorrow.
What?
2 weeks from tomorrow, as a matter of fact.
2 weeks
yes,
tomorrow.
We need to meet. We need to meet in New Orleans. I understand that you were willing to play the part of Bishop Polk.
I would be. You know. I mean, not too much has changed. You know, the only difference between now and then is that my horse is made out of steel.
Well, I think it would be fabulous. We need to get a group together to appear at Christ Church Cathedral in New Orleans 2 weeks from tomorrow. And the more folks who can appear in Confederate uniform, the better. And basically, at this stage, all I can really offer by way of an inducement is I'll take everybody to lunch afterwards. Near where I live, but I would really like to get the. This is going to be. We've been in the sesquicentennial of the war between the states for several years now, and on January the 18th, Cathedral in New Orleans, they're going to the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church is going to lead an ecumenical mass of racial reconciliation. And in a word, my position is that's a fraud. It's a fraud that is part of a very destructive process in the United States right now. And it's not good for black people, it's not good for white people, and the main reason it's not good for anybody is because it so wildly distorts history and confuses people about what happened in the past, and as a consequence, what's happening right now. We've mentioned the word slavery several times during this conversation, and the truth is, slavery, like so many other concepts, is not an absolute. It is a continuum. I mean, any time you restrain someone else's liberty, that is an aspect of slavery. That is an element of slavery. In many languages other than English, the connection between the what you might call the slippery slope of slavery is so obvious, because all of us spend part of our lives, in at least part of our lives, in a condition analogous to slavery. Do you know what that's called?
What?
It's called childhood. We are not free when we are children. Why? Because we don't have the tiniest clue when we're born how to survive on our own. And in many languages, including Latin, as a matter of fact, the analogy between slavery and childhood is very clear. Even the word about how you become an adult is directly related to how you come out of slavery. Both words are emancipation, which comes from Latin take out of the condition of being in someone else's hand. Manukapio, manu is the Latin word for hand, capio is the Latin word for take. Ex manukapio, out of being taken in hand. That's what emancipation means. And that's the word we use when kids want to be adults at age 16, 15 or 16. We call that emancipation. We call it emancipation when slaves cease to be slaves. But the point is, every person who's ever been alive and ever had parents has been in something analogous to the condition of slavery. And so we cannot say that slavery is either totally unnatural or it's totally destructive. Because, as you know, for children, it's necessary to keep control over them in order to be adults. Now, in the history of the world, slavery has meant a whole bunch of different things. It happens that my specialty, you mentioned my years in archaeology, it happens that my primary specialty in archaeology was actually Mexico, Central America, southeastern part of North America, the Mississippian culture, group of very similar societies. And one of the key features, especially of Mexico, was human sacrifice resulting from warfare. You know, people have seen the Aztec calendar stone. Millions of people have visited the archaeological site where I did my doctoral dissertation. It's called Chichen Itza in Yucatan. It's just due west of Cancun. People go in by the bus loads. They don't get a very complete picture if they don't spend at least a couple of days there, but if they manage to spend a couple of days, they see the skull racks, they see the ball court, and they get the feeling that death by human sacrifice was probably one of the more common ways of dying in that society. And if people have read anything about the Aztec society from William Hickling Prescott's Conquest of Mexico about Cortez and Bernal Diaz, or if they've read it, I forget who wrote the novel Aztec, Gary Jennings. The Aztec culture is also famous sacrifice, and after performed sacrifice, altar art to the gods. The most common feature of sacrifice all over the New World was the consumption of the rest of the body. Now, cannibalism, in other words, when Columbus first arrived in what we now call the Caribbean, he named the entire region, the Caribbean, after cannibalism. The word Carib means cannibal. And so it's one of the most common features of the cultures of the New World. But when I was doing my doctoral dissertation, I was engaged in what people very dramatically call in anthropology cross-cultural studies, structuralism, comparison of one civilization with another. And that led me to study sacrifice and the rituals around power and kingship in Africa. And through the writings of several hundred different authors, I became very familiar with the dramatic similarities, really, between African divine kingship and the divine kingship of Mexico and Central America, and particularly the use of sacrifice, human sacrifice, in perpetuating the power of kings. But what is relevant about what we're talking about, the Confederacy here, it has been known for a very long time, and I do mean a very long time, that the vast majority of the slaves who were originally purchased in Africa. Purchased, not captured. You read the popular literature these days. You read the stories, and we get the idea. I mean, I think it's really very degrading to black people in a way. I think that black people should hate this image of them, that they were so stupid and so weak and so fragile that all the white people had to do was go over to Africa and basically lasso them in their natural state and bring them in as slaves. That wasn't how the slave trade worked. The slave trade worked because without any prompting from the white people, African societies for many hundreds, probably thousands of years, had been collecting groups of slaves and keeping them. There's not just abundant, there's overwhelming documentation of this from every single part of Africa, that corrals were our word corral that we use for cattle. Those words were originally used for human beings, for slaves. Corrals were places where basically human capital was parked after being captured in warfare, either in preparation for formal sacrifice or just informal cannibalism. Now, the defenders of the South pointed this out in the early 19th century, and the abolitionists absolutely hated it, and they still absolutely hate it when you bring up this subject, they'll tell you that this is just wild-eyed pro-slavery Southern apologetics with no foundation at all. But it turns out it is not. Like I said, it's not only slightly known; it's indisputable that slaves were captured in Africa, as in Mexico, as in Peru, as in North America, in ritual warfare, the purpose of which was to keep each and every society well supplied with sacrificial victims. You had wars of conquest, which would do this, but you would also have ritual wars where there was no purpose for fighting at all except the exchange of sacrificial victims. And these sacrificial victims, for the most part, were destined for cannibalism. Now, why is that important? It's important because at this ecumenical mass of racial reconciliation that the presiding bishop is going to hold on January the 18th of this current year. I almost said this coming year, but the year has already come. It's already 2014. On January the 18th, they're going to have this ritual where all the white people are supposedly going to literally, not just figuratively, but literally get down on their knees, as we do in the Episcopal Church, and beg forgiveness for our sin, our mortal sin of slavery, of enslaving black people. Now, I am not in favor of slavery. As a matter of fact, I'm here on this program with you right now saying that I think that it is the most unnatural thing in the world for you to want to control me, or for me to want to control you, or anything you do. And if it's unnatural as between you and me, it's unnatural between us and everybody else, and people being black or red or yellow does not make it more natural for us to want to control them. It is equally unnatural. But if it is to be said that we committed a horrible, our ancestors, you were talking about who our grandparents slept with, if we are trying to make up a story based on what our great-grandparents, or more likely their grandparents and great-grandparents did, and then apologizing for that and saying that somehow this apology, this abject apology for the sins of our ancestors is going to make the modern world any better. We are totally deluding ourselves, and we're telling a terrible lie, and we're confusing every aspect of the issue completely. Now, I just can't stand that, because if the churches have any purpose at all, it's to help us think clearly. I think that, there is nothing better than people getting together and praying. And by praying, I basically mean thinking quietly, reflectively, trying to clear their minds of deception and lies, and a mass of racial reconciliation whereby, the dean of the cathedral gave a sermon back in August, I guess, where this is Dean Duplantier. He gave a sermon where he compared the incident. I don't know if you remember it last summer when Oprah was in Switzerland, and supposedly some clerk told her that she probably couldn't afford what she was looking at, and the implication was that they told her that this was because she was black, and of course that this was part of what we've got to apologize for. I mean, I can't even follow it when I'm repeating the story to you. It makes so little sense. It makes so little sense to say that because Oprah's grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents were slaves, that some woman in Switzerland who didn't recognize her as one of the biggest television personalities in the history of the world, somebody didn't recognize her and just thought she was a poor black tourist from the U.S. Who couldn't afford what she was looking at. For one thing, I feel most sorry if there's any truth of that story at all, I feel most sorry for the clerk, because she was probably fired right away. If she didn't recognize Oprah, major celebrity visitor, and didn't try to sell her the most expensive thing in the store right away, she wasn't doing her job. So I feel terribly sorry for her. I don't feel a bit I don't feel a bit of sympathy for Oprah that she would have felt offended that somebody thought that she couldn't afford something, because she could have bought the whole store if she wanted to. And we all know that. And it's hard to feel sorry for people who can walk in and not just buy whatever they want in the store, but the whole store. But this is what you call extremely fuzzy thinking. And people who believe in racial reconciliation and for, what do they call it, reparations for slavery, indemnity for slavery, they are all engaged in horribly, horribly, horribly fuzzy thinking. And it's destructive. And we need, basically, to educate people about the historical reality that slavery was opportunistic. The trilateral slave trade was opportunistic, Europeans taking advantage not of Africans as people, but of the African institution of slavery, which pre-existed the slave trade. Do you see the difference there? It's not that Africans were stupid or weak or just innocent natives wandering around ready to be captured, like dumb animals or something. That's terribly just degrading to black people, and it ain't true. In fact, what we see is that starting in the 15th century, so really starting earlier than that, Arab traders, found this vast quantity of readily available human merchandise in Africa, and the Arab traders started importing this human capital into the Middle Eastern world, the Ottoman Empire, the various caliphates, and taking advantage of the fact that there was this surplus capital in Africa that wasn't being used It was basically destined for food consumption, but it was fine human capital that could be much better used for labor. And so the Arab traders discovered it. The Portuguese and Spanish realized what the Arabs were doing, and they got into the picture. And then ultimately, the Dutch, you mentioned the role of the Jews in the slave trade. Well, where did the Jews learn it? The Jews learned it when they were living in Spain and Portugal before the expulsion of 1492, and so they took this knowledge up to Holland and England and Germany and the places they lived after they were expelled from Spain and Portugal. It was a perfectly natural thing to do. They weren't specifically doing it as Jews. They were specifically doing it because this was what they had learned was a really good business while they still lived in Spain and Portugal. And I don't blame them for it more than I blame anybody else. I don't blame the Jews. I don't blame the Africans. People in Africa saw that they could make money off of these slaves, which was worth more than eating them. People in Europe saw that they could make money off of taking the slaves to the New World way more than they could and nobody in Europe really wanted to eat them. And this is another thing you find in this apologetic, weak-minded, stupid literature that's proliferating online about how blacks, when they were in the slave vessels coming over on the trilateral trade, they were afraid they were going to be eaten. Well, the incidents of cannibalism in Europe in the past 3,000 years are few and far between and usually punishable by death. So cannibalism in Europe and among European peoples just hasn't been a really big problem or issue at all. But in Africa, it was very common, and it remained common up until, as a matter of fact, very recently. You can read about cannibalism continuing in Africa up until very recent times, and the use of human body parts and all sorts of interesting things in East Africa up to this day. The fishermen particularly value albinos because albino body parts supposedly make the absolute best bait for bringing in lots of fish. I mean, okay, Africa is Africa. It is not, however, it is not a continent of weaklings or stupid people. It's a continent of people who basically had what we call primitive conditions until fairly recently, and in some cases still. But they were not weak and they were not stupid. They were selling slaves. They were making money. They were the biggest protests in the 19th century. The only protests, as a matter of fact, the only major protests in the 19th century over the abolition of the slave trade, you know where they came from? They came from Africa, because the people who were selling the slaves in Africa were objected to, this sudden embargo on one of their favorite products. They got more, the African nations, chieftains, whatever they were, the African slave traders were basically put out of business, and it was part of the decline in the slave trade that made Africa so susceptible to colonization in the late 19th century. Isn't that funny? Isn't that funny that we are apologizing for the abolition of the slave trade, and of course we're also, the same people say that, we should be so apologetic there. The British are talking about paying reparations for colonialism, for the suppression of the Mau Mau in the 1950s in Kenya, apologizing for trying to suppress terrorism. Maybe we'll be paying Osama bin Laden's grandkids at some stage because we gave him such a bad rap. I don't know. All 20 of the descendants of all 20 of the hijackers in 9/11. Maybe we owe them money for giving them such a bad rap? I'm not really sure, but the bottom line is
you shouldn't put down Tim CIA operative Tim Osmond, you know. Now let me go back here. You know, I had just had somebody on my show a few months ago that from South Africa that's done a lot of research on South Africa and found cities in South Africa that are 150,000 years old. He talked about the gold mines in South Africa, and he blamed it on extraterrestrials. I'm not sure. I don't think you can tell the difference between some extraterrestrials and us. So maybe we're the descendants of the extraterrestrials, and maybe they used the blacks to mine the gold in Africa 150,000 years ago, where they built stone cities like they did in Peru, in Colombia, in Mexico. We can't build a pyramid today. We can't lift those rocks that they used in the Middle East to build some of these cities. Maybe our whole history here is just totally screwed up. I mean, maybe we are the slaves, and again, they've just refined it so they don't. They're using 21st century technology, which may not be as good a technology as they had 10,000 years ago. Am I just off the wall here, or am I asking some of the right questions?
My perspective is that sounds kind of off the wall. I spent almost 10 continuous years, involved in archaeology in Mexico and Central America and South America. And one thing, I guess the place to start, also Egypt, by the way, and although Egypt was a minor area for me, the Mesopotamian Egypt, but in Egypt and in Mesoamerica, in Mexico, Central America, they have done experiments, and with relatively low-grade technology such as rolling logs, you can move gigantic stones. You can use the combination of rolling logs and ropes and groups of very strong men. You can actually move these stones in a very low-tech way. There are a bunch of different experiments that have been done on how long it takes, and it ends up not taking all that long once you do what are called replication experiments. And I don't think that we have to ever invoke mysterious things like UFOs to explain the cities of Egypt or Peru or Central America. I mean, I know a lot of people who find this kind of thinking very appealing, but even in my own field work, I've worked with the Indians in Guatemala, in Honduras, in Mexico, and Belize, and I have seen individuals who can lift incredible loads. That you wouldn't, our so-called bodybuilders, our athletes, they could train for years and they'd make a big show of being able to, with great difficulty, raise, something that weighs 1,000 pounds. Now that would be like a star bodybuilder with ripped muscles and just big show type material. I have seen ordinary Indians, maybe not ordinary Indians, but ordinary men of fairly extraordinary strength who can pick up gigantic boulders with or gigantic, even gigantic tree trunks that probably weigh 1,000 or 2,000 pounds, and do amazing things. We are so weak. We are so weak compared to our own ancestors. You know, you look at what even the Vikings or the Anglo-Saxons could do in the way of construction of Gothic cathedrals, in the way of medieval castles. They were lifting some gigantic stones. We know those were our ancestors. We know those weren't extraterrestrials. And there's no reason that we should say that the Indians of Mexico or that the ancient Egyptians couldn't have done this. As far as cities in Africa, I have not heard of these cities you mentioned that might have been 150,000 years ago. Archaeologically speaking, one of the most amazing things about Africa is that really, uniquely, among all the continents, sub-Saharan Africa has no major cities, no great civilizations, no literate civilizations at all until the advent of the slave trade. Again, this is, I'm sure, about as politically incorrect a thing as I could be saying. I hope that I don't get assassinated on the street for saying it. But the reality is that Africa, prior to the slave trade, sub-Saharan Africa had no civilities. In terms of ordinary archaeologists can find, the African Iron Age was very rich. It was very productive. It was very complex society, comparable to Europe in about the time 2000 BC, 5 BC. But as far as anything comparable to the ancient Greece or the Roman Empire or ancient Mesopotamia or even ancient Mexico, there is nothing in Africa prior to the advent of the slave trade. It's with the slave trade that Africa starts having actual literate history. The literate history is basically because of contact with Spain and Portugal and the Dutch and English slave traders. And yeah, you begin to have actual states. You can start making maps of Africa starting about 1500. You can start making maps of the primarily coastal states, chiefdoms, and kingdoms of Africa. Prior to that, there is no actual history of Africa for most parts of Africa. The earliest literate civilization south of Egypt would have been Ethiopia, and yes, it goes back quite a ways, but it's also very close to Arabia, and you know, it's basically more part of the Near East than it is part of Africa. And as far as, you know, Uganda or the Congo or Zimbabwe or South Africa itself, you can do archaeology. You can cover the archaeological history of these time periods. And like I say, there was a lot of very interesting art and productive trade going on during the African Iron Age, but it did not reach the level of statehood or literate civilization until the contact created by the slave trade. And it is the withdrawal of the slave trade that made these states collapse. It deflated their economies. The abolition of the slave trade did, and made them subject to colonialism. I mean, we can gain so much in the way, I think, of genuine reconciliation of the fictitious racial conflict that has been foisted upon us by socialists, basically. If we start learning actual history, and if we start discussing what actually happened, and understanding that real history is the best defense to any kind of bigotry. Real history is the best defense to saying that Africans are inferior people, because they weren't inferior. They may have developed later, because, now why would they have developed later in history as far as being civilized is? The easy answer to that is, not everyone in the world needs to be civilized. There is a strong argument that civilization is a degraded and destructive way of life. Civilization tends to destroy freedom. Isn't that ironic? The people who don't live in a state society typically are much freer than those who do. Africa was a very rich place. It was a very easy place for people to live. There was no great need for irrigation in most parts of Africa, no great need for any of the institutions which usually give rise to statehood. And so maybe that's why Africa developed so late, is because it was a rich tropical environment where there was no need for civilization. And that would be a good explanation for why Africa developed civilization so late. Be that as it may, I think it did develop civilization late, and I don't think that that's anything for Africans to be ashamed of. And I mean, I don't see anyone in Mexico saying that, we should apologize to the descendants of the Aztec or the Maya for saying that they were cannibals. We don't, we don't want to have a cannibal society here. That doesn't mean going to the ruins of ancient Mexico and say, oh, what a horrible thing, these things are so awful, they were built by cannibals. I don't hear any tourists saying that. I don't hear any art historians saying that. I don't hear any archaeologists of any kind saying that. We understand that different civilizations evolved for different reasons in different parts of the world. And so we need to understand the truth about history, the truth about how Africans were not helpless. They were not just victims of slavery. They were basically a proud, paleotechnic, opportunistic people, just like the Europeans, and they saw the opportunity to make money by engaging in slave trade with the Europeans. And does that make them worse than the Europeans? No. Does that make them better than the Europeans? No. It makes them pretty much damn like the Europeans. It means that at that point in history, two parts of the world came together by an exchange of values. Human capital that had been accumulated for other reasons in Africa was exported to the New World, and this is neither a shame nor a disgrace to the Africans nor the Europeans. It's a pretty strong statement of equality. And if people can grow up and understand real history, in my opinion, that is true reconciliation. That is the true cure for racism and people looking down on each other or being divided by false history, and understanding that in the history of the world some crappy things have happened. And I'd be willing to go so far as to say that the trilateral trade slaves between Africa, Europe, and the Americas was one of the crappier things that happened in world history. It is nothing that human beings as a group need to be proud of, but by the same token, it's nothing that we as white people need to be apologizing to black people for, any more than the black people should be apologizing to us for having sold us slaves. Nobody would ever ask that. But if nobody would ever ask them to apologize to us for selling us slaves, why should we apologize to them for buying the slaves? Is it better to be a slave or, consumed in a cannibal stew? I'm not really sure, because I've never done either. I guess I've been closer, because I was a child once, and I've also been arrested, to being a slave. than I have been to being in a cannibal stew. And I guess there's, as long as you're alive, there's always the possibility of freedom. And, you know, the slaves in the United States certainly had a significantly greater life expectancy than the slaves who remained in Africa. You know, they were allowed to form families. Maybe these families were sometimes broken up in the slave trade. There's some debate about how often that happened. Maybe slavery in the New World was a better life for a lot of these people. I think we need to be open to the possibility that it was. I'm not saying that it means that I'm defending the institution of slavery. I just want to know the truth, and I know that since a lot of the slaves in Africa would have been eaten, I know that the business that's saying that their life expectancy is greater here is true, and if their life expectancy was greater here, and you know, one of the interesting things about slavery in the New World is how little it was resisted. Now think about this. In the Caribbean, in all over Brazil and the American South, compared to the number of slaves that there were, how few slave uprisings ever happened. You know, okay, we know about Nat Turner, we know about Haiti, we know that there were some major slave rebellion. We also know that the one in Haiti was specifically incited by the wild rhetoric of the French Revolution. But, you know, when there was that revolution in Haiti, there was a huge exodus of black and white Haitians. You know where they came? They didn't mostly go to Europe, where the blacks would have been free. The blacks who could get out mostly came to Louisiana. That's how they got voodoo, as a matter of fact, in Louisiana. And so, yeah, 2 weeks from tomorrow, I would really like to meet you and as many people as we can get to come to Christ Church Cathedral at 2901 St. Charles Avenue in New Orleans. Anybody who's got Confederate uniforms, who's ever been engaged in Confederate reenactment, it would be great to have them show up to. Like I said, all I can offer at this stage is a big lunch afterwards, but let's tell the presiding bishop that we don't like fake history. We don't like fake apologies, and that we are not trying to put down black people. When we say, don't make white Southerners apologize, don't even ask us to apologize, because what we were really fighting for in 1860 is exactly what many people are fighting for today: the right to self-determination, the right to govern our own lives, the right to raise crops without government instruction, the right to raise whatever crops we want to without being called criminals. We are fighting for the same kind of liberty now that our ancestors were fighting for 150 some odd years ago. The battle is just a lot tougher now because 150 years ago there was near equality between the armed adults, the armed adult male population known as the militia in every state, and the federal government's army. There was near equality, and so we could preserve our rights then. Now the people are outgunned. You know, all this dispute we're having about small arms and automatic weapons is sadly too little too late. Even if we had complete freedom to own our own small arms and automatic weapons without government regulation or interference, we would still be hopelessly outgunned by the government compared with what our ancestors were in the 1830s in Texas, in the 1840s in Mexico, in the 1860s in the United States itself. We are at such a disadvantage right now if we ever wanted to try to regain our freedoms. A tank costs more than most people can ever dream of buying. A tank, the cheapest tanks cost about as much as 20 homes on a normal city block. The absolute cheapest tanks. And the government has unlimited supplies of tanks. They have unlimited supplies of armored personnel carriers. We are outgunned. So we need to take control of our history. We need to take control of our heritage. We need to take control of our identity. And by learning real history, that is how we have to do it. We have to contradict people when they ask us to apologize for the condition of black people in America, because the condition of black people has not been that different historically than the condition of poor whites, as Mr. Phil Robertson, of Duck Dynasty pointed out a couple of weeks ago, to the great consternation of the mainstream media. It's totally true that black people and white people, for in particular the period 1865 to 1960, those 95 to 100 years after the war of the war between the states, the people of the South, black and white, were all oppressed people. One of my earliest professors in archaeology was born. His name was Robert Walkup. He was born in South Carolina, and he was a truly brilliant archaeologist. And he had gone to Harvard when very few Southerners were being admitted to Harvard. A lot of Southerners used to go to Harvard before the war of 1860 to 65, and these days there's really no difference between the South and everywhere else as far as who goes to Harvard. But in the 1920s and 30s, Robert Walkup attended Harvard, and he was basically his advisor's most brilliant student by his advisor's own estimation. And the president and fellows of Harvard University would not permit a Southerner to become a tenured professor at Harvard at that era, because of the legacy of the war. So a white Southerner of fine family and descent, of brilliant credentials, was basically, to use the N-word, he was being treated like a nigger. And that was because of the prejudice of this terrible war that killed 600,000 people in the 1860s. And the people who won the war were the ones who were the nastiest about it and who put down everybody. Once we understand that, once we understand those aspects of race relations and regional relations, what they used to call sectional, not sexual, sectional relations in the United States, that, I think, is a kind of reconciliation that has more meaning. Why were Southerners who had fought for liberty considered dirt in the North? Why were they treated like some kind of exotic species of parrot? People made fun of their speech. People made fun of, I went to Harvard, and you notice I've got no trace of a Southern accent, particularly. I guess.
Yeah, mine only slips out with y'all and can't and ain't. Now let me ask you. I want to mention one other thing. I've been to Guatemala. I climbed to the top of one of those pyramids, And one of the things that I found pretty interesting is that standing on top of that pyramid, my friend didn't climb to the top with me. He stayed down to the bottom. And I said something to somebody up here on top. He could hear every word I said at the bottom of that pyramid, 50 feet away from the bottom of that pyramid.
Hmm.
I thought that was pretty interesting.
Well, I mean, they clearly designed them for that purpose. I mean, they designed it so that the priests at top could be heard to the degree possible by people below, and they worked on maximizing acoustics everywhere. They clearly did not have electronic megaphones or anything like that. But you find that all over the place. Where did you go? Did you go to Tikal, or which side did you go to?
I don't recall. I remember having to hide my camera when I passed a military base, and I'd just been down in Belize looking for gold. I found the gold, but in the stream where the gold was, on the banks of the creek there, with a big nice arch over there by it, there was also about 1,000 rounds of spent ammo. So I decided I wouldn't be able to, even if I found the gold, I wouldn't be able to get it out. so I cut my trip short to Belize. But
if you were in Belize, you probably went to Tikal then, because that would be the biggest site that you'd come out of Belize and be likely to see. Was it a site developed for tourism, or was it a sort of an abandoned site?
it's kind of an abandoned site. I didn't see many tourists, and somebody that was taking me through the jungle, they were driving about 30 miles an hour through grass as tall as the. I said, how do you know where you're going, man? And they pulled up and stopped at the edge of a cliff. He said, well, you have to watch where the trees stop. But
in several places.
now, what was the name of the person that's buried in this cemetery here? The Confederate is a Confederate general, right?
Oh, it's not buried in. Again, this is a part of the irony here. It's not that we're buried in a cemetery. General Leonidas Polk, first cousin to President James K. Polk, who presided over the annexation of Texas in the Mexican War. Leonidas Polk was the first Episcopal bishop of Louisiana, and he's not buried in any cemetery. His tomb is the largest and most elaborate tomb in Christ Church Cathedral in New Orleans, and it is right behind the pulpit where the presiding bishop is going to be speaking. And I think this is all the more reason that somebody needs to be there speaking in the voice of Leonidas Polk. Leonidas, named after one of the great Spartan warriors of ancient history, who also fell in battle, coincidentally.
I wouldn't mind doing that. There are some Confederates that I really couldn't support, like Albert Pike.
Well, all I can say is my grandfather was an Albert Pike Mason. My grandfather was an Albert Pike Mason, and he had that the Southern. It's called the Southern Rite of the Masonic, the Scottish Rite Masons. The Southern branch, I forget what it's called. I never got into it myself, but Albert Pike's picture and signature was on like 24 different books my grandfather had, and he was a 33rd degree Mason, and he was a member of a couple of other organizations that Albert Pike was famous for being associated with, and I have heard interesting stories about Albert Pike, but my grandfather was a great American and great Southerner, and I just have to mention that whenever people talk about the Masonic conspiracy and Albert Pike.
Well, I've got a novel that I wrote about. It's called the Lucifer Legends, and of course I've got Albert Pike in there. in that book, or in the screenplay that I did for HBO, who said, and Pike said, Masonry, like all religions, all the mysteries, Hermetism, alchemy, conceals its secrets from all except the adepts and stages or the elect, uses false explanations and misinterpretations of its symbols to mislead those who deserve only to be misled, to conceal the truth which it calls light from them, and to draw them away from it. Truth is not for those who are unworthy or unable to receive it, or would pervert it. The truth must be kept secret, and the masses need a teaching proportioned to their imperfect reason. Every man's conception of God must be proportioned to his mental cultivation and intellectual powers and moral excellence. God is, as man conceives him, the reflected image of man himself. Now that sounds pretty intelligent to me, but his next statement reduces the Masonic philosophy to a single premise. Pike writes, Lucifer, the light bearer, strange and mysterious name to give the spirit of darkness. Lucifer, the son of the morning, is it he who bears the light with its splendors intolerable, blinds feeble, sensual, or selfish souls? Doubt it not. And that, folks, is the basis of a book I started 45 years ago. I'm still doing the researching on that book. I haven't released it because I wasn't ready.
Hey, here's what I think you ought to do. I want you to bring it over to New Orleans in 2 weeks, and let's see if we can make this into a little bit of an event. Maybe get some attention on these issues, and I would very much like to review that book with you.
Be glad to. You know, of course, got to warn you in advance. It's also got UFOs in my novel that I'm working on. It started out as a short story. Lucifer was the second in command on the Earth, what I call the Earth ship Heaven, built by the Atlanteans to survive the last passing, the celestial conjunction of the crossing of planets near this planet that contributed to the destruction and the electrical discharge on the planet Mars and the flood here on Earth. And Lucifer, the captain of the Earth ship Heaven, one of the 6 or 7 Earth ships built, the Olympus and the Asgard and a few others, didn't make it. The Earth ship Heaven survived, but the captain went insane and kicked Lucifer out of the Earth ship Heaven into the hell that was Earth at the time. And then I bring it about 5,000 years into the present. So it makes for an interesting read. I wrote it as science fiction. Now I'm not so sure it was.
Well, I look forward to reading it. What can I tell you? I look forward to meeting you in New Orleans. And let's just be in touch over the next couple of days about how we can make this happen. And
all right. The problem that I have is one that the reason I restarted the Free American is because it's for sale on my website, freeamerican.com, shop.freeamerican.com. It's for sale for $2.99, and we've got, they've tried to break me, they've tried to kill me, they've tried to silence me. I need backing. I need a little help. I need to raise some money. You can't put on an event with no money, and that's where I've been for 10 years.
Well, we're doing everything we can through the site. I want everybody to look at is Southern Spirit Rising. We're still developing it, but we've got a lot of stuff up there. Southern Spirit Rising, and I would like to say that this event on the 18th is just going to be the first thing that we want to do. I want to have a series of events this spring, and maybe we can develop them as time goes by. The 150th anniversary of the death of Leonidas Polk as he was defending the city of Atlanta. against the most brutal mechanized attack that had ever been launched on any city anywhere in the world.
All right.
June 14th of 1864.
All right, we're out of time. I gotta go. Thank you. We'll do this, and we'll put the information up on my site. Thank you. God bless you. Have a great weekend, folks. Bye bye.